ordinarily, the standards by which we judge individual and government action are radically different. And this is a result of the way that discretion plays into both. For the individual, discretion is usually related to the pursuance of a long-term goal. And it helps to develop a consistent sense of self because one is constantly engaging in a rational process and seeking out action that orients one towards a goal. However, because this is a consideration of long-term self-interest, the truly rational person will recognize that one's desire to attain an end cannot be served if one alienates someone on whom one may later come to rely. So there is that natural buffer against aggression and against doing harm to others. The state, however, when it pursues a discretionary course of action, doesn't have the same incentive to tread lightly on others and to respect the rights of others. Because it has that monopoly on force, it has no incentive to engage in this kind of respect. Because if it comes up against a roadblock, normally in the form of someone else's conflicting self-interest, it can simply exercise its ultimate authority and get rid of them. So discretion when pursued by government is a negative because it usually infringes upon liberties because the state will pursue its self-interest over and above the interests of citizens. But this is a different story when it comes to individuals in interaction because the idea that people have to interact helps to keep individuals' transactions honest between each other, at least when rationality is the basis of interaction. However, when we come to foreign affairs, at least constitutionally speaking, this is the one political area where the executive has legitimate authority to base his actions and his decision in his discretion and his judgment. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution, which outlines the bounds of executive power, gives the president authority over affairs external to the nation, primarily to anything that relates to management of the military and to diplomatic relations as well. The president is really the chief diplomat. And this is because the president is really the sole political figure we have who represents the nation as a whole. Even though we have a federal Congress, each member represents their constituency and they're primarily are answerable to the needs and the interests of their constituents. That's where their first loyalty lies. The president, however, his constituency is the nation as a whole. This includes both the people and states because they too are constitutive members of the polity. And as a result, he is uniquely positioned to represent the nation as a whole in ways that no one else in politics can. Because the president has this kind of unilateral authority and because he has the requisite constitutional power to act on the basis of his own discretion, this means the basis by which we judge his actions needs to change as well. And we need to see him not primarily as an agent of government, but as an individual. And this means the role that discretion plays is going to change as well. And we now need to look to value in a more active role and in a more theoretic role. We certainly don't want government to select for values, again, because it means that government is then actively pursuing one set of value to the detriment of competing sets of values. And that means that individuals lose their freedom of conscience and their freedom of association and a whole host of other things. But when an individual bases their actions in value, this is a net positive. And it also means that because that long-term self-interest, which is to say rational self-interest, because the individual exists in the long term and not the short term, and this affects how the individual behaves, particularly in regards to the way that we treat with others. There's nothing to say that you can't be friends or have a relationship with those with whom you inherently disagree on values, but the likelihood is because you have not as much as common, you're not going to become close with such a person, and that you're going to seek out like values when you form your relationships, because To value something is really the definition of admiration. And this needs to be applied to foreign affairs in the seeking out of allies whose individuals' ideas of value align with our own. And I'm, of course, getting to the issue of the North Korea summit and the agreement which was signed between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And because we're dealing with individual interactions here and not primarily with state interactions, the role that value plays needs to take on this different tone. And there needs to be a recognition that we can't serve value or our own self-interest, since rationality aligns long-term self-interest with the propagation of values. So self-interest can't be served by treating with individuals who have directly contradictory ideas of value. And this is true in the case of our agreement with North Korea. We need to think in the long term and not in the short term. And unfortunately, this is what realpolitik doesn't want to do, because now we're dealing with more theoretic considerations and not pragmatism. And the idea here is that because the individual sense of self is rooted in value, anything that violates that value can't be beneficial to the self. And this is true in foreign relations as well. By treating with dictators, by people who do not value human rights, who do not value individual freedom, President Trump is ultimately belying the United States foundation as a country that, above all other things, values individual freedoms and values self-sovereignty and the rights of the individual to be free from government oversight and from government oppression. We are, in fact, making ourselves party to what the North Koreans do by disregarding these actions and by heaping laud upon Kim Jong-un as a great negotiator, although I have to say I do agree with this statement, since we have signed a treaty without any real detail, which means that we've committed ourselves to something that may further violate our values in the future, and that is a bad deal for us and a good deal for the North Koreans.